That's the great thing about being a professor from New York. Who needs microphones? It's wonderful to be here. Thank you. My name is David Lankus. I'm a professor at Syracuse University iSchool. And I'm at a point in my life where I probably have a few folks out there that had the unfortunate occurrence of being in one of my classes at one point. Yep. So when I repeat the same stories over and over again, it's not Alzheimer's, it's being a professor, but there's not a lot of difference between those. But I couldn't help it being in the land of Dewey that I couldn't tell my Dewey joke. So here's my Dewey joke. God calls a meeting, and into the meeting he invites Linnaeus, the father of modern classification, Melville Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System, and Betsy, a recently deceased public library director. God says to the three, he goes, well, I've done it. I've called the end. I've called the rapture. I've brought up all the souls from earth. They're in the room behind the door, but I've got a problem. The problem is when I came up with this plan, there was like this Adam guy and this Eve guy, and they were fighting over a rib, and you've been busy, and there are now like billions of people behind that thing. And I need help figuring out who gets to go upstairs and who gets to go downstairs. Linnaeus, confident in his sort of European way, says, I'm on it, goes through, opens the door, 30 minutes goes by, hour goes by, 2 hours go by. Linnaeus finally opens the door, struggles, shirt torn, looking distressed, and he's like, I ran out of Latin. I made it to steampunk Japanese cosplay manga people, and I just gave up. And Melville Dewey, being the retiring, shy personality we know he had, says, no problem, I've got this, walks through the door confidently, hour, 2 hours, 4 hours go by. At 5 hours, he crawls out of the room, glasses, just going crazy, pulling out what little hair he had left that I can identify with, and says, I couldn't do it, I ran out. I ran out of numbers. I kept going, and I got all the Christians done just fine. But I couldn't do it. Betsy goes fine. Walks through the door. 2 minutes later, walks back, says, done. God said, what did you do? She goes, it was really easy. I asked everyone who had ever voted to raise a library budget to raise their hand, and I told the rest they could go to hell. My Dewey joke. All right. So what I would like to talk to you about is day 45,626. We are at our 125th anniversary. We started back in 1890. We're on home turf. And what we need to worry about is not necessarily what's come in the past, but where we're going, what our future is. Can you all hear this now? Am I not feeding back viciously? All right. So we're going to have that discussion, but in honor of, the 125th anniversary and the fact that yesterday was Back to the Future Day, we'll begin looking at the past and going back about 45,000 days. So here we go. And so, of course, we start with Mel. And Mel and colleagues and friends in upstate, somewhere where they were trying to create utopia for some, said, thou shalt have Nyla, and here we are. It's wonderful. So, interesting things happened, right? So shortly, this was his sort of second version. His first one was something called the American Library Association, done at the Centennial. And a little bit after he got here, he decided that, there was this adoption of the ALA motto, which is to this day the ALA motto. The best reading for the greatest number at the least cost. Right? This was adopted in 1892 and restated in 1988. Now, what's interesting about this motto, what's interesting about this mission is it looks really good. It looks really interesting. But it's not. If you look at what was intended, how you read it is not how it was intended at the time. As an example, and slightly out of sync, but you'll get the point, one of the big debates at the time was what we meant by best reading. Now, as someone who has put forth the idea that the mission of librarians is to improve society and heard an earful of what you mean by improve, I'm really happy to blame this on someone else because what did it mean to be about the best reading? Because it's not how we interpret it, right? It's not, oh, there's good stuff and everyone has good stuff and multicultural and it's lovely and let's all get together and have a commissioner of education talk about the importance of reading. That's great, right? This is a quote slightly out of time, but very much indicative. And if you haven't had a chance, Wayne Wiggins' new book on the history of public libraries is an amazing text, and I highly recommend it for nothing else than finding these lovely nuggets. This is from the Californian and Overlander in 1892, but it really represents the discussion. The question, the reporter was trying to say, who reads these things called fictional novels? School children, factory and shop girls, men who tended bar, drove carriages, and worked on farms and boats. And boats. And finally, this is where it gets good. Fallen women, and in general the denizens of the midnight world, night owls, prowlers, and those who live upon sins and its wages. I think I hear from a few boat drivers and fallen women in the audience. Now, what's amazing about this is when you read, this was indicative at the time that we were putting fiction and novels into our libraries, and this was what led to massive discussions and debates and censorship and all of this wonderful stuff that today we preserve for pornography and filtering at the time. I mean, the other quotes that I don't have directly, but it was something to the effect of, these young schoolgirls are reading novels and they're sort of getting ideas above their station, and the young boys are reading novels and all they care about is going to the frontier and fighting the Injuns when they should be back on the farm with the haystacks, right? So this is what we meant when we said the best reading. What we meant was the right reading, which was primarily defined as the white European canon, and within it, nonfiction. So we need to talk about, as we move forward, how does this mission 45,000 plus days ago influence where we're going to go in the future? And the short answer is, it doesn't do it on its own. What we need to understand is that this mission of best reading and etc., which is still the motto of our National Library Association, in a different interpretation, that motto has shifted and changed. And that motto has not shifted and changed because librarians alone had a conversation about what they wanted to do and where they go. There were brave librarians throughout this entire process that made an argument for fiction, that made an argument for the playground of the mind, that made an argument that narratives are essential to the development of society. There's some wonderful authors that talk about, for example, in the developing world and in Africa, that the Western culture, particularly U.S. culture, has a very limited view of what happens in Africa. Right? It's AIDS and starvation. And the reason that they have this is because they have so few narratives to work on. That what do we see in the news? AIDS, starvation. AIDS, starvation. But what is happening in the literature, if you spend just a little bit of time, is you see stories of coming-of-age tales. You see stories of teenage girls figuring out their place in the world. You see detective, dime store novel-esque stuff. You see a whole civilization and culture that too often gets reduced in what we can report quickly and what's a quick tagline. And we have librarians who understood that and the importance that fiction belongs not simply in our public libraries, but our school libraries, our academic libraries, our special libraries, our business libraries. That they belong in homes, that they belong to be celebrated. But this did not happen simply by librarians doing it. It happened because the world changed. So put yourself for a moment 125 years ago. I'm a balding guy with glasses and a beard. Luckily, not a misogynist anti-Semite. But when we pronounce, we need a library association to face the future, and that's our motto. Think about what has happened over that time. Start with some of the simple stuff, if we will. For example, in 1900, Ellis Island opened, and for approximately a century was the largest port of entry for immigrant populations. Waves of migrants that today we look at the migrant crisis in Europe and we talk about immigration in the South, but at the time, this dwarfed what was happening. from Ireland, from UK, from Eastern Europe, from Russia. Fleeing from tyranny, fleeing from war, looking for economic development. These immigrants came in and they helped shape a country, and they helped needs that shaped services, and they began to vote, and they began to express themselves, and they began to create a whole new culture that was, frankly, unanticipated just years before. What else happened? Well, let's take a look. So we also see something like the federal income tax, right? Remember that NILA was formed 45,000 days ago. We didn't have to pay a federal income tax. There was no Tea Party, and there was no discussion about deficits and debts because it just didn't happen. And the whole notion of large libraries in the federal context didn't happen. Big government, here it is. The income tax, the discussion that began back in the day, that continues to this day and has morphed and changed and talked about what is a civic responsibility, what do we pay taxes for, is that a burden or is that the cost of having a civil society? That dialectic, that change in text, that way began all the way in 1913, completely unanticipated before it. We begin to look at something like the award to end all wars. So, 1914 came, and by 1980, we had solved the war problem. So, back in the formation of NILA, there were wars, it was problematic, taken care of, all done. So, then what else happened? Well, a couple of things happened. One, we decided for some reason we didn't need to drink anymore. And once again, if you're, in NILA, you understand this has big consequences for librarians. I love, by the way, the next juxtaposition that happens, which is the idea, first of all, note the signs, a bunch of men walking around, we want beer. After Prohibition was put in place, women's suffrage, women got the vote. Like, we're not doing that again. And note the sign, it says, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? So I know it's a sexist comment. I try not to get into gender politics and such. But once again, men walking around with signs going, we need beer. Women walking around going, we want liberty. Now, I do pick on Mel a lot. But, he did some good things when he went and created the first library school, which was, a couple of years ahead of time. And the people of Columbia realized that he was going to admit women in the program. They then said, you may not meet in our classrooms. While Columbia had no strict laws or regulations against women students, they simply said no. And so Melville said, well, too bad, went next door to an open area and did it anyway. Right? So certainly when we talk about women's suffrage, we talk about women's movements, this had a major impact in librarianship and how we serve and who we serve. We talk about the idea of an evolving culture that at the time when this organization was formed, at the time when we put forth the vision of the importance and values of libraries, at the time when librarians were becoming professional, we were an area that actually looked in social change. Social change around gender, social change about power in a society. We then look at something like the largest wealth disparity by 1928. We saw the largest wealth disparity in this country. That the top 1% of earners, of income taxpayers in the country had the most wealth, over 50% of the wealth of this country, than the rest of the culture. By the way, I know it's really tiny in the back, but all you have to pay attention to is the nice U shape of that graph, because that starts around 1928 and it ends in 2010. The only reason that we don't currently live in the era of the largest wealth disparity in this country's history is a little thing called the banking crisis, where the top 1% had a hiccup and decided to deflate the entire world economy. So we have to wait another year and we'll be back in the Gilded Era that Fitzgerald wrote books about, that once again we finally got into our libraries. So this happened, and then maybe as a result, We had television. This was good. That had a bit of an impact in terms of what we want, right? Number one media type circulated by our public libraries around the country, DVDs, right? So it's lovely that we get together and talk about learning from books. It really is. But let's acknowledge that we can also learn from Back to the Future and Blu-rays and 3D printers and lots of different things. And it began back in this era. Now, I'm not saying television had anything to do with the Great Depression, but some might say that, right? So this really changed the world. This changed how we thought about, this was our national identity in challenge. Not only was this a matter of having people that living on the street, having people losing farms, having a whole generation change the idea of the American dream from we shall succeed to simply we want to survive. It's an attitude that has persisted to this day. It's an attitude that changed the concept of what it meant to be an American and what it meant to have social responsibility. The notion of the social safety net changed from philanthropy of those who had to an obligation of its citizenry. And we saw that in everything from how we looked at our agricultural policy to how we looked at drinking. So, another change. We saw in the New Deal the idea that we as a society, there are things that are simply required to be a citizen. There are things like electricity. Once again, 1935 might seem like ancient history, but if you look at it, it's sort of a midpoint from Nyla beginning to here. We were still talking about electricity. As I drove here, I don't know about you, but I drove along the wonderful North Country to get into the Adirondacks, and I saw a lot of homes that probably still are working with electricity issues. And frankly, this is not that different from our current discussions about broadband and the internet. I saw a lot of satellite dishes. I saw one mobile home with 4 satellite dishes on it. And I can only imagine what was going on. I mean, it could have been the NSA. I'm going to say it, but... So we began talking about social safety net. We began talking about what is our responsibility to our fellow man and woman and child. We began a whole new idea that a liberal democracy does not mean that our politics are way outside. It means there are things that are no longer votable and negotiable. Freedom of speech. We will no longer have anything discussion about it. It is there. We have it. It's done. And we're now having those conversations again on a whole range of issues, now around broadband, around healthcare, around all of these things coming back to greet us. So clearly we didn't listen well enough because we had this little thing called World War II, right? And World War II saw many things, many great things. It saw a generation re-energized, re-embraced, and looking at their role now internationally. We saw them moving out and looking at how they could bring the world about. But the other thing that we need to understand is it also took that federal income tax and began using the money on basic research. They began flooding money into our higher education system, into professors, into research, the National Science Foundation. And it changed higher education as we know it. It forced a race to funding. The whole publisher-parish world certainly became accelerated at this point. With the advent of the Manhattan Project, we saw the role of research in warfare. We saw information was no longer a luxury around reading. It was to be weaponized. It was a power. It could help move for good or for bad. We began looking at a whole different way because then we moved from World War II directly into the Cold War, which once again, I put a lovely end date on there. And apparently Vladimir Putin doesn't listen to my presentations. The atomic bomb was a product of that research, of that information. There's a great NPR story that talks about the library during the Manhattan Project out in the West as they were working on the bomb and how they had to secretly do their acquisitions through like third parties to get information for the scientists as they developed this. So we look at a whole new world, a world of mutually assured destruction, a world of ideology, a world where we've gone to the international stage and we've found others on the international stage and that has brought conflict. In 1953, who at NILA could have thought in 1890 that we would begin to unravel the basic DNA and the code of our own humanity? What it means to be human, what it means to be normal, what it means to have a disease, the whole idea of disability, bringing in the new concepts of how we could treat and fight disease, beginning to talk about where do we go with this. We live in an era where we simply assume that DNA is out there. We understand how reproduction works. This was not a world that existed before 1953. Things like the polio vaccine came out. Once again, I love my colleagues. I do. I love you all dearly. Each one. But there was a time that as a professor I had to do peer review on articles. And the articles would come out and they would always be about Twitter, or at the time MySpace. I'm not making this up. And they would always begin with the new epoch in humanity has begun because we have the World Wide Web. As we know it, all things in the universe shifted when we did our first tweet. And I'm like, really? You're telling me that HTTP:// has changed more lives than indoor plumbing? Really? Than the polio vaccine that brought people out of iron lungs, that when we began looking at mass vaccinations, and by the way, I have a 1.5 year new immune system from a stem cell, so if you haven't been vaccinated, don't talk to me. I have a stake in my health, and clearly you don't care about it. This public service brought to you by People Against Jenny McCarthy. So, we have a whole new way of looking at it. And then, what else happened? Well, Martin Luther King gave a really lovely speech in 1963 and solved the racism problem forever. So after we'd gotten rid of war, now racism is done. We're doing great. But in truth, I laugh, but think about what that was. How that talked about the best reading for the greatest number of people. And suddenly the greatest number of people as a society, we made sure that people were defined as people. Regardless of their color, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender and their sexual preferences. They are people, they are citizens, and they are neighbor. And by God, by 1967, I don't care what color's in a couple, they're allowed to get married. 1967 is when the Supreme Court said that you could marry someone of a different race. Greatest number of people. Least cost. Imagine now thinking about 45,000 years ago, and then we did this little thing. We went to the moon. We went to the moon. That's amazing. We suddenly became a small rock in a much bigger neighborhood. We became a whole new way of understanding it, right? And then we did something greater. We developed the beginnings of the internet because we needed cat videos once we went to the moon. And by the way, I've made sure that's not actually a Michael Caine picture. That is a real scientist that did that, right? And ARPANET began because academic libraries and academic institutions got together and they networked and they combined. And the beginning of the ARPANET eventually led to the internet, eventually led to commercialization. But, in 1973, we got tired and we developed cool new phones that you had to carry around in your car, right? The cell phone, 1973. Today, it's amazing. I don't know about how many of you drove up here, but if you're like me, you couldn't have made it unless there was a map sitting in front going, turn now, Dave. Right? I have a colleague, Steve Sawyer, and Steve was a merchant marine at one point, and he went to a conference and he with a colleague, and the colleague said, well, we have to drive from Denver and we've got to get to Boulder. Do we know how to get there? And Steve said, yes, I got a map. I know how to get there. And like, well, aren't you going to use Google Maps? No, I got a map. Well, aren't you going to use a GPS? He's like, there are very few people in the world who can say, I quite literally have an undergraduate degree in navigation. I can make the map work. All back to 1973, getting started with that. And then, we jump ahead. This little thing called the World Wide Web came out. That was fun. And then the towers came down. And once again, the world changed. One of the amazing wonders One of the great things is that I was invited to speak to my neighbors, to speak to my colleagues, to speak to fellow New Yorkers, to speak to people who I see and work with every day. And this moment, we know, whether you were in Manhattan or anywhere in the country, but anywhere in New York, we still feel this moment. And we still feel this moment, and this moment has had ripples that we did not anticipate. Ripples that began discussions of endless war, began surveillance society, began thinking about, wait, what is security versus privacy versus freedom? How do we make that equation work? And our calculus on this day changed. And we're still living with that. How, in 1890, could we have anticipated a world where people can fly airplanes into buildings? And what do we do about that? And I don't know about you, the day after this happened, I was running a project called Ask Eric. We answered questions of teachers and policymakers around education. And we got a lot of questions the day after. But those questions, they weren't about airplanes. They weren't about the towers. The questions they were asking is, what is a Muslim? What is Islam? This is the first time I've heard of these terms. And at that time, we as librarians had an opportunity that I fear we did not take good enough advantage of, which was to fill a void of lack of information, a lack of information that has turned into policies that are frankly disastrous. Disastrous policies that began because there was not enough information, conversation, and community going on. And we're still living with that. But there's hope. There's hope because in 2015, if you had asked me 10 years ago, will I live in a society where gay marriage is legal, where we have at least a somewhat unified healthcare system for the country, where we can have open conversations about where we're going, I would have thought you were crazy, but we have hope. The world has changed again. And what I want to point out into all of these changing worlds is that while that sounds like stuff that was out there, while that sounds like things that wasn't our fault or wasn't our opportunity, I ask you, would we have gone to the moon without academic libraries getting together and accelerating the academic conversation? Would we have gone to the moon without an active scholarly discourse occurring from academic journals, through publications, through university presses? Universities, academics, librarians made that possible. Would we have a discussion about gay marriage and interracial marriage and freedom and the definition that all men are created equal and all women are created equal and the opportunities that we have as a country is because we acknowledge it without law librarians and law libraries sitting before those people standing in front of the high Supreme Court? We are part of that movement. We are changed by that movement, and we change that movement. We are locked and engaged in this discussion. If those immigrants had come off of Ellis Island to nothing, to simply the slums of New York City or New Jersey, without public libraries going, come here, we can help you with language, we can help you with opportunity, we believe that education is important. If school librarians had not taken up the cause to educate the world, regardless of their race or gender, would we be able to go to the moon, to have these kinds of social movements? We should be proud of what we have done. We are a noble profession, a profession that has been shaped by society, but has shaped society. We are part of this story, a story that too often we do not acknowledge or tell, and yet that is our history. That is what we inherit. And so we come to today, where I think there's some expectation that I'm supposed to tell you what's going to go for the next 45,000 days. And I'm going to do my best. But it's crazy, right? But the point is that what happened for those 45,000 years, Israel Zangwill said, our past is for our inspiration, not a prison that we have to live in. That is an amazing history that we can take pride and a little guilt over, but we can learn from it, but we're not trapped in that history. Because the important thing is not what happened on the day 45,625. today, it's what happens tomorrow. I have been accused of being a library futurist. It is a nasty slur. I don't know about you, but every time I see a tweet or a Facebook post or a book title that talks about the future of whatever, you just sort of go, oh God. The future starts tomorrow. The future starts with the decisions you make today. The future starts with what you listen to today and tomorrow, the sessions you go to, the friendships, the relationships you connect in, and the dedication and where you decide you want to go next. So, we're all in the future business because hopefully we'll all be here tomorrow. So what is it? What do we need to worry about next? What is going to set the agenda? Maybe not for the whole 125 years, but at least for day 1, and day 2, and day 3. And it's going to be invented and developed not in the ivory tower, but on the streets. It's going to be developed by what you do when you go back and you have an undergraduate who comes to you and says, what is a peer-reviewed article? It is going to be shaped by someone coming off the street into your public library and going, I knit. Is there some way I can help? It's going to be shaped in our school libraries when the brilliant kid comes into the library and the not-so-brilliant kid comes into the library, and it turns out the not-so-brilliant kid does a hell of a lot of teaching of the brilliant kid. What happens when we embrace society? What happens with our doctors? What happens when our doctors encounter a patient? And they then learn that compassion's kind of important. Another fun joke. Any surgeons in the room? Surgeons love talking to their patients only after the anesthesia has been administered. How does that change? That changed because we help. We show up. We go into the room of patients and say, what do you need to know? Right? When you get a diagnosis of cancer, when you get a diagnosis of diabetes, when you get any sort of diagnosis this day, the first reaction is this. And if you are not as close as this, not in place of, not to replace, but as close as this, when they get those top 10 search results and don't understand the first 3 are from drug makers, the next 2 are going to tell you about holistic healing through stones, right? And the third, maybe the 8th one is by Sloan Kettering. We need to be there. We make that on a day-to-day basis. That's how we're going to create our future, not by grand pronouncements. But I'm going to make some suggestions to you of some things that I think we should work on. I think they're as big looming today as migration was at the time, as civil rights was at the time. First thing, learning. We are in the learning business. You are educators. I don't care if you work in a law firm. I don't care if you work in a Fortune 500 company. I don't care if you work where you work. It doesn't matter. If you are a librarian, you're an educator. Doesn't mean you stand in front of classes and come up with class lesson plans and that, but you may. But ultimately, the concept is that as librarians, we believe in a better tomorrow. We believe in a better society. We believe in improving things. And we believe that comes from learning, from knowing, from understanding. That more information makes things better. So we have to first look at how we're doing as a state and as a country in learning. We must make education effective and affordable. In our schools and colleges and then ourselves, it is untenable that librarians do not get professional education because they will never be able to repay the debt that must change. My dean loves it when I bring up this point. It's not just librarianship, of course. We have now people graduating from colleges that have $200,000 of debt. In this country, credit card debt is now the second largest form of consumer debt after education debt. We have created a system where it's necessary to get higher education to move forward in society and then made that system prohibitively expensive. This is not a formula for success. And as educators, we should be part of that conversation. We need to be part of that conversation in our schools where we go to our school boards. We need to be part of that conversation in our universities where we sit on senates. We need to take leadership positions. We need to get elected positions. We need to... What was she?
Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. Has invited our input. Yay! Let's make her regret the day she did. We have an opportunity with her. I really believe it. I think it's a wonderful thing, but if we sit and wait to be asked, we're not going to be. I am so tired of a librarian telling me, oh, it's important, but no one asked me. Don't wait. Don't just knock on the door. Break it down. Bring your own chair. Sit and say, you may now begin. I am here. That's how you make a difference. No one has ever changed the world waiting to be asked to change the world. We go forward, we go with a plan, we go with a vision. And librarians, as educators, as a strongly connected profession, you guys, we talk to each other all the time. We can talk about it, we can rally it, and it can be more than one legislative day after the agenda has been set. It should be every day on a regular basis. And frankly, it shouldn't be us going to Albany. It should be all the brilliant people that we helped. It should be new Americans who learned language skills. It should be our children who now get to graduate from college. It should be the next Rhodes Scholar. It should be the next Nobel Prize winner going, I would not be here if it weren't for my librarians. And by the way, it's not the building, and it's not the charter, and it's not the books that make that happen. It is you. It is your responsibility and your honor to be the impact of our profession. Every one of us. There is no room for worker bees. There is no room for spare parts. We are all now essential advocates for a better society through knowledge, and we need to fix our education to make it happen. And by the way, school librarians, I love you. You know I do. But you cannot rail against an over-assessed, standardized testing environment where we are kept to standards and tests and then move into other environments where you insist on the same type of assessments and evaluation. Invent, try, experiment, be new. And I'll tell you the other thing. I want you all to go and get my job. I need more people going and getting PhDs because we don't have enough people to hire as faculty to prepare the next generation for this. In a distance program. Right? So, we'll fix education. What's next? Privacy and security. We must spearhead privacy and security in this age of surveillance and monetizing of our data. We must recognize, preach, advocate, and make real that security comes not through recording our phone calls, but in stronger, inclusive communities where neighbors know and respect neighbor. If you want to have a secure environment, you have a secure community. If you want a secure community, you have a friendly, communicative community. We come together, we commune. And we're not going to do it in the firehouse, and we're not going to do it in the police station. We're going to do it in the public libraries, and we're not going to do it in reading class, and we're not going to do it in science class. We're going to do it in the school library. We're not going to do it. Well, we are going to do it in the bars. But if we want the faculty, there are different bars, to be part of it, we're going to do it in our libraries, and even amongst our lawyers and our doctors and our engineers and. We have an amazing position begun well over 125 years ago where libraries span domains. We've always said, oh, it's so hard to figure out what a library does because we do so much. That's our power. Our power is that we can bring people together around knowledge, around learning, around making things better. And so when we have a library in Vermont that decides to become a Tor server, that's cool. When Homeland Security tells you to take it down because only thieves use Tor, that's bad. When the library board says, oh, that's how it works? We're doing it again. That's fantastic. We cannot promise anonymity. We cannot promise privacy and then hand out tools from third-party vendors that sell people's data, that capture their reading habits. We can no longer simply assume that anyone with technical skills is our best interest in mind. We must adopt those technical skills, so those are our apps, and those are our policies, and that's our security. We must reach out and form partnerships where our values become instilled in others. We must instill the values of librarianship, the principles that we hold dear. We must inject our values into corporations and governments alike. Library science must inform information science, computer science, economics to do good as well as doing well. Now that might sound like I'm ending on a really sort of wimpy note, but I ask you again, we didn't get to the moon without librarians. We didn't get to this point where all people have social equity and value without librarians. Do we want to move forward in society where those values are put aside because we can monetize our data, where students are no longer students with likes and loves, but they're simply data to be fed into a system that will personalize their education? Are we going to look at our undergraduates not as people who are going to someday run society, but instead as sources of information that can be sold in commodities? Are we going to look at the classrooms as things where we create teacher-proof technology because learning has become training, and training is only valuable when people get certain jobs in the STEM disciplines? How many people here believe that the STEM disciplines alone have crafted our society? Thank you. It's amazing what we can do with technology, and I'm a geek of the deepest sort. Right? When I talk about poetry and the humanities, Bill Gates weeps. But it's true. Just as we learn new cultures come from the stories they tell, new inventions come from the stories we tell. Yesterday was hilarious because it was Back to the Future Day. Michael J. Fox changed the cover of USA Today. Hoverboards. There are people spending millions of dollars to develop hoverboards because of Robert Zemeckis. Star Trek has influenced my career as much as Stephen Hawking ever did. And by the way, too. We tell stories. We do help with STEM. We teach people. But we teach people holistically because we see the people who walk into our buildings and where we walk to as people, as complex. And so we come back to this. The best reading for the largest number at the least cost. And we ask, will this do for the next 45,000 plus days? All right, we can change it. We can nibble at it. That best reading, we now know from study after study that the best reading is called reading. And oh my God, it's happening on a screen. It's happening. I have a 12-year-old, right? Oh, kids don't read this day. Yes, they do. I walk by his door. I throw books in, big, heavy books. And because I'm not going in that room. And all I hear is done. You know what? He finished Harry Potter, the first one, in 4 days. And this was when he was 9. And my wife and I went, yeah, right. And we quizzed him because we're that kind of parents. And he beat us. Well, who is this? Oh, you mean that person? I think you were actually thinking about this one. Yeah, he's snotty too, but we'll deal with that later. Best reading is reading. By the way, the best way to get better at writing is reading. Best way to get better at reading is writing. It turns out they're the same thing. It turns out when we look at our libraries not as places to consume or to pacify or to occupy or to silo, but look at places of creation, whereas Fayetteville would say every person is a maker. Whether they're making on a 3D printer or whether they're making the next dream or the next invention or the next idea, that's what librarian patrons are. Let's stop being patronized and let's start being energized by our communities. Let's Stop thinking of our communities as people who pay tax bills and start thinking of our communities as the most valuable, important, special collection that exists. Your communities are full of authors. They're full of authors in waiting and authors. They're full of scientists. They're full of inventors. They're full of creators and videographers. They're full of passionate people. And then they walk into their library. Do they see a welcoming arm that doesn't simply say, you can sit here? But welcoming arms are going, thank God you're here. We need you so much. Let us stop asking our communities what we can do to help them. How can I help you is potentially one of the most arrogant questions that we can ask of someone in our libraries. And you're sitting there going, whoa, I wanted to help. I'm sorry. But what does it say? How can I help you? Because clearly you couldn't help me. Clearly you're the one in distress. Clearly you're the one with the big hole in their head that I need to fill with some brick of knowledge. Why not ask, what are you passionate about? What do you want to do today, tomorrow? What do you want to be when you grow up? And ask that of 67 and 98-year-olds too. Because that's the one thing I didn't put in this slide. When we began 125 years ago, average life expectancy of a male, white, in the United States was 44.5 years old. I would be dead. Thank you. By the way, female, 48. Non-white male, 38. Today, 76. And not even, but getting closer. We have invented, just as in the 1900s and the 1800s, when we, as a society, invented childhood. We did. Childhood that we think of as a natural and organic thing really is the result of policies and law that said, you know what? 8-year-olds don't belong in a factory. They belong in a school. That was a choice that society made. And guess what? We have another choice amongst us, which is if you retire at 65, you have potentially 20 and 30 more productive years of contribution to make to society. What do we do about that? Have them read? Great. They should read and write and think and talk and build and change and push. For the largest number, amen, amen, amen. For the least cost. Do we really want to continue to be the low-cost provider for knowledge? Are we satisfied with being the really efficient Walmart outsourcer of education? I don't think so. I think we talk about effectiveness. I think we talk about what we can do. I think we talk about what we can become, because I don't think this works anymore. And I don't know if this does, but let me at least try one. I think our motto is to improve society through knowledge, one community at a time. We don't do it as we looked to do it in 125 years ago by all adopting the same metric system. We don't do it by all adopting the same floor plan. We don't do it by turning librarians into spare parts. We don't do it through constant efforts to standardize and reduce cost regardless of efficiency. We do it by turning to our communities and looking like them. Does your library have a reference desk? I don't know. Let's ask the community if we need one. Does your library have a 3D printer? I don't know. Let's ask the community if they need one. Do you have a collection? I don't know. Let's ask the community if they need one. The days of saying this is what a library is over. The standard definition is over. The days of worksheets and kits and just take it from another library and plug it in at work is over. And that means your job is more important now than it has ever been in society. The next day, tomorrow, is when you own everything that happens in your community, when you realize you're the most valuable resource that is in that building, when you understand that your community is not deficit, your community is not wanting and errors and problems to be fixed, and how can I help you? But when we realize our communities from Ivy League, communities of small cities, communities of big high schools and of little schools, of lawyers and of doctors, that these communities desperately want to be better. And it is in their aspirations and our dreams that our future lies. The next 45,665 days comes from our decision today and tomorrow and the day after to improve society on a regular basis and to know that librarianship and librarians are essential to that society. Thank you very much.